I am now. So we are beginning tonight in Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22. In Luke 22, 23, and 24, just three chapters, talks about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And so we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about a lot of details and all that's happening here. We start off in Luke chapter 22 with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, when you go back to the book of Exodus, we've keyed in on this idea before, but I emphasize it again. There was the Feast of the Passover, and then Exodus chapter 12 was bringing this ideal out. It's reiterated again in the book of Leviticus, but this was something that they were supposed to do. It usually happened around the springtime. And to make a long story short, you had Passover, and then immediately following that was a 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread, to remind them of the fact that they were not to take leavened bread with them as they're leaving Egypt. They didn't have time to allow the bread to rise. So this Feast of Unleavened Bread, a lot of times as you're reading in Scripture, Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread are tied so closely together that we think it's one big feast. Yeah, but it's not true. You would have that Passover celebration, and then you would have that 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread. So it actually was two different feasts as the way God was emphasizing it. So here he emphasizes here, he said the Feast of Unleavened Bread drew near, which is called Passover. Remember that Luke is mainly writing to a Gentile audience. So he was trying to help the Gentiles to understand the fact of when that time was. Whereas if you're reading Matthew or some of the ones that's written specifically to the Jews, they will emphasize just that it's the Passover feast. All righty. So when you go back to Exodus chapter 12, you remember the whole circumstances behind that. This is when God delivered the children of Israel from the Egyptian bondage. He gave them specific rules and regulations in this. We see that this was the Passover regulations. He says, you go all the way through Exodus chapter 12. He emphasizes this whole idea. 7 days after that, verse 15, you shall eat unleavened bread. The first day you shall remove leaven from your houses, and whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. Then he says there's the first day there will be a holy convocation. The seventh day there will be a holy convocation. So it ties so closely together. You have this. Now, this was probably in April in the year that Jesus died, when they figured it out. Now, a lot of the times the Jewish calendar is not the same as our calendar. We go by the solar calendar. The Jews went a lot of times by the monthly calendar, the lunar calendar, okay? So that's the reason why every year the Passover is going to be at a different time in that respect. So here's this situation, and they're getting close to this, and the chief priests, the Bible says, and the scribes sought how they might kill him, for they feared the people. Even though a great feast was about to take place, they could have cared less about this. They wanted Jesus dead. They have had it with him, and this was all it boils down to. Listen to what he says in Matthew 26, verses 1 and 2. It came to pass when Jesus had finished all these sayings that he said to his disciples, you know that after 2 days is the Passover, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. So Jesus prophesied that he was going to die at the Passover. Then the chief priests, the scribes, the elders of the people assembled at the palace of the high priest, who is called Caiaphas, and plotted to take Jesus by trickery and kill him. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. So they have made their plans to kill him. But they said, we're not going to do it now, because we know that the following of Jesus up to this point in time, he's got a lot of followers. We don't want to create that kind of problem. But something happens to where Jesus literally falls in their lap. I think there was also at the same time this similarity between Exodus, whenever the children of Israel left the land of Egypt, and what's happening now. What happened shortly after they left the land of Egypt? They traveled down to Mount Sinai. They received the new covenant, or the old covenant. Now you have Jesus, the second lawgiver. He's coming. He's dying as the Passover lamb, and he's going to institute a new covenant. So it's all tied together in that respect. So this was was happening in that respect. This Passover supper was to be eaten on the 14th day of Nisan, which is a Jewish month. It would be 14 days after the first new moon following the spring equinox. Okay. So if you look all of that up, you can kind of figure it out. So it probably was in April. And so think about this whole thing. This word he says here, the Passover, is also called Pesach, which means Passover itself. And they're looking again. Now, Matthew tells us that they said that they weren't going to kill him because they feared the people. But notice verse 3. Satan entered Judas, surnamed Iscariot, who was numbered among the 12. And we can get into a long discussion about this. Did Satan just enter Judas because that's who he decided to pick? Or was it because Judas had a disposition in his heart? And we knew that Judas was the one who carried the bag. Obviously, from what we read in other passages of scripture, there might have been some mishandling of funds. Surprise, surprise, surprise. Yes, sir?
I mean, there's a lot of argument about that, whether or not Satan was like literally
Mm-hmm.
like, it's like when he says to, when he says to Peter, remember, he says, get away from me, Satan, or get behind me, Satan.
Right.
I mean, Peter's obviously not inhabited by Satan.
Right.
The ideas in him.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
That's it. And that's the point here. And that's the point I'm trying to make here as well. Satan accomplished his possession into Judas's heart because Judas wanted him to. In other words, he allowed him to. And again, today, we can give place to the devil. Paul will emphasize in Ephesians 4:27, neither give place to the devil. Don't give him the foothold. Don't give him the toehold. So the ideal is we have the right to choose. James 4:7, resist the devil and he will what? Flee from you. So I think that's exactly what's going on in this respect here. So that's Judas allowed him to do that. So what did he do? Now again, Matthew's account says he was going to wait till after this feast, but Judas went on his way and conferred with the chief priests and captains how he might betray them to him. Or betray him to them, I'm sorry. I think it was. John suggests that idea because, again, John had emphasized the idea. I'm going to try to see if I can find the exact passage that brings out that. Let me see. It's John 17. He prays for the disciples. Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. And this is where John 18 is where you have the same accounts that we're reading about right here. But if you look up all the accounts of Judas in scripture, it emphasizes that, here it is. In John 13, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, he loved his own who was in the world. The supper being ended, the devil already having put into the heart of Judas Iscariot to betray him. All righty. And again, there's another passage earlier emphasizing the idea or suggesting the idea that he carried the bag, which would be the purse. And so maybe he had been appropriating some money out of the collection. And that may have been part of the reason why he did what he did. Bottom line is he made that decision. I'm going to sell him. Other people have argued. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Apparently, he knew what they wanted to do.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, and they may have.
They probably said, "Well, we'll give you some money. Tell me where this guy's at."
And that's part of what it boils down to as well. And then think about it in this respect. Maybe he thought that, and I've actually read some commentators have suggested the fact that Judas did this to try to prod Jesus into showing himself to be the Messiah.
There's a whole
Yeah.
doctrine.
There's a whole doctrine along that line. I think it's just simple greed. I think it's simply that he was upset because Jesus didn't do what he thought he ought to do. He was either pushing Jesus or something, but the bottom line is he made that decision. Satan didn't force him to make this decision. He chose to make this decision. So we go a little further. He conferred with the chief priests and captains how he might betray him, and they were glad and agreed to give him money. So he promised and sought opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of the multitude. There's the idea. We don't want a bunch of people around him whenever we arrest him, because if they do, we know that they all believe he's Messiah, and this would have created an uproar. Yeah.
I mean, at first Peter fought back, right? And then
Yeah, we're going to try to look at all the context of that and try to come up with it together. So
yeah.
hang in there with me a little bit further. Okay. Now, the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. So again, go back and read Exodus account, Leviticus account when it talks about this. And he emphasizes the idea the Passover was killed. So he sent Peter and John saying, go and prepare the Passover for us that we may eat. Jesus was going to die at the same time as the Passover. So there was going to be that symbolism there. Just as the old covenant was ratified by that, now you have the new covenant being along that same line. Here was the day of unleavened bread. The day of unleavened bread was a day when the people, as they partook, they were supposed to clean every bit of leaven out of their house. In fact, from some of the sources that I've read, whenever they did this, a lot of the priests would send some others and go into everybody's house and make sure that there was no leaven at all in any of these people's houses. And again, this became a lucrative business as well. They would sell their leaven to their friends, maybe that were Gentiles, that didn't care. And then they would turn around and buy that leaven back whenever their feast of the unleavened bread was over with. And you see, and there just happened from, again, some of the sources that I've read, happens where the priest knew who to sell it to. Who's going to get money in the process? He's going to get his part of it too. You see, that's the way they are. So he sent to Peter and John saying, go and prepare the Passover for us that we may eat. So they said to him, where do you want us to prepare? He said, when you enter the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house which he enters. Then you shall say to the master of the house, the teacher says to you, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will show you a large furnished upper room. There make ready. So they went and found it just as he said to them, and they prepared the Passover. Now, as you're reading this account, and you read it again in Matthew, Mark, and John, you see all of this tied in together. And some people have made the argument that perhaps Jesus had already made these preparations. But Jesus, again, is expressing his divine foreknowledge. Notice he said this man was going to be carrying a pitcher of water. Now, that was not the work of men. That was woman's work. All righty. And that's what have perhaps drawn this as a little bit odd. This was the work of a servant and women. But Jesus knew exactly when Peter and John would get there, who they would see, and tell him to go and prepare for that in that respect. So he must, according to some commentators, this guy probably was a wealthy disciple of Jesus and was making things ready. The homes of the wealthy had a two-story. There was two stories to it, to their houses. Guests could enter and leave the guest room on the second floor without disturbing the householder's family on the first floor. You know, maybe they might have a higher street on one side and a lower street on the other side, you know, and so they could enter into both of them in that respect. So this upper room was spread out. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. You shall say to the master of the house, you're following this guy into the house, And he says, the teacher says to you, where is the guest room that that I might eat the Passover with my disciples? So they're doing that. And they went and found it just as he said to them, and they prepared the Passover. I think a couple of semesters ago, we went through the book of Exodus, didn't we? And we talked about how the Jews celebrate Passover today. And there's actually videos on the YouTube where you can actually see how Jews celebrate Passover today, how the Passover meal had certain sections in it where they would sing certain songs. They would sing Hallel songs. I wish we had the time to go over that in a great deal of detail, but I would strongly encourage you, if you had the opportunity to do it, just look up Jewish celebration of the Passover, and there are some Jewish rabbis that actually show you how they go through it, what goes on at each particular part of the meal, and things along that line. All righty. Now, I want you to think about the idea that part of this would include the bitter herbs, the sop, things along that line. If there were, think about this for a moment. If there, say, were 1 million people in the city of Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, it could very well possibly be that 100,000 lambs would have been killed in one day. Everybody would have had a hand in killing all those lambs just for those Passover meals, okay? I mean, it becomes a very lucrative business. Think about this. And that would average probably 4,166 every hour, 69 lambs every minute, to try to get everybody. And again, under the Old Testament law, they had to take the lambs to the priests to sacrifice them. So just picture that in your mind. All of these preparations would have taken place on Wednesday and Thursday at that particular time. And then it was right after that that Jesus, at this particular time, he emphasizes, beginning in Luke 22:14, when the hour had come, they're sitting down, eating this Passover supper.
Don't you think, though, a lot of that stuff, like God put that there in a way to make it difficult?
I think so, but he also made it difficult so that to test whether or not they are faithful, to test whether or not they did what they would obey him or not. And that's a good point. Sometimes that's there. Notice what he says. Jesus said, with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Now, he had told his disciples time and time again, I'm going to have to suffer. And I really wanted to share this Passover with you at this moment in time. For I say to you that I will no longer eat of it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. Now, we understand that this is where Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. And I believe what happens here is Jesus and his disciples probably partook of the Passover. They went through that celebration the way they needed to. And then before it ended, he instituted the Lord's Supper. First, he took the cup and gave it to them. Now, through the course of a Passover celebration, there would be 4 different times that the cup would be offered. And the cup would have a certain amount of wine in it. All right? And at the very end of it, that's whenever they took that cup for the last time, that would be the end of the Passover. But instead of that just being the end of it, the Bible says he took the cup and said, take this and divide it among yourselves. For I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. So I think what's happening in verse 17 and 18 is the Passover celebration has come to an end. And he's emphasized to them, he says, and this was the thing, like I said, this was the demarcation point of the end of the Passover feast. But he also says what? There's something more to it than just this. I will not drink of this fruit until the kingdom of God comes. Then he took the bread. And again, this was the feast of unleavened bread. So it's that, in that respect, he gave thanks and broke it and gave it to them. This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And he took the cup after supper. Do you hear that? So we have here in Luke's account twice where the cup is being drank. And it seemed like for a long time, I was trying my best to figure out exactly what was going on. You had the cup, then partaking of the Lord's, the bread, and then the cup. But again, as you study this in detail, he finished that Passover meal, then took the very same emblems and emphasized, this is my body. This is my blood. This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you. But behold, he says, the hand of my betrayer is with me on the table. Now, I want you to think about this. Did Judas partake of the Lord's Supper? That's another big question, okay? And it seems like if you're really looking at this, and when you look in Matthew, Mark, and John's account, as well as this account, it seems like here he's saying that Judas was there. But Matthew, as well as Mark, emphasized the idea that Judas had left. So what is he emphasizing here? He's saying here that Judas had left to go what? To talk to the high priest, you meet them in the Garden of Gethsemane. And what he's saying, he said, the hand of my betrayer is with me. Notice the word is in the New Testament, in the New King James Version, is what? It's in italics, suggesting that it was added. So he says, behold, the hand of my betrayer with me on the table. My betrayer was with me on the table, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's right there right then.
What do you mean that? I know what
They added it to make the English, make it sound good. Okay. All right. So Judas had been there. He had partaken of the Passover. He knew where they were about to go. Think about what was happening. Judas, he didn't really know what was going to happen after they partook of the Passover meal. But obviously, Jesus had talked about it. As soon as we get finished here, we're going to go to the garden. Now he knows exactly where to meet them. He knows exactly where to take the soldiers to arrest Jesus. And so he slips out. John gives us a little bit more of an account, and as well as, again, Matthew, where he looks at Satan, or excuse me, looks at Judas and said, what you do quickly. Knowing, and Judas knew full well of what he was about to do. So all of these things were taking place at that moment in time. You have to look at all the stories together to see how it plays out. And then he says this, the Son of Man goes as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom he is betrayed. And you remember Judas left. What was he going to do? Jesus said, go. Would you go do it and do it quickly? When Judas left, they thought that Jesus told him to go buy some more things for the feast, right? Matthew's account tells us that. So all these things were going on behind. And I think Jesus looked him dead in the eye and said, whatever you're going to do, go ahead and do it. I know what you're going to do. I know what you're about to do. And if Jesus knew that, that was an encouragement to Judas. What? Don't do it. But he was bound and determined. He was bound and determined. So they questioned among themselves which of them it was who would do this thing. And interestingly enough, when they start discussing this, think about it from this viewpoint. They're looking at one another. Would you do it? Would you do it? Would I do it? Would I have that in my heart to betray the master? No, not me. Certainly not. But also with that, there was also this dispute as to who was going to be the greatest. Now, how many times have we seen, as you go through Jesus dealing with his disciples, how many times has this issue come up? Time after time after time. Right? Peter, James, and John obviously were Jesus' closest friends. He took them up on the Mount of Transfiguration. And maybe, according to some people, Judas felt like he was the outcast out of the group because, we don't know. We're just making a lot of assumptions. We've got to be careful. And Jesus then spends some time. He says, listen, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them. Those who exercise authority over them are called benefactors. So again, what he's emphasizing in all of this is that, you don't be worried about who's first, who's second, who's third. You realize that he who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger. He who governs as he who serves. The greatest among you are going to be what? The person who serves others. The person who serves others. That has not changed. And so we are challenged in our lives that if we want to really be great in the eyes of the Lord, we have to be the servant of all. And that's hard for us because we want people to what? Serve us. And I think at this time, as you're reading here in Luke's account, whenever they get into this discussion, you also now have to turn to John 13. Because what does Jesus do in John 13? They get into this discussion as to who's going to be the greatest among them. And what does he do? When Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from this world, having loved his own that were in the world, he loved them to the end. Supper being ended, the devil having already put it into the heart of Judas to betray him. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand and that he had come from God and was going to God, rose from supper, laid aside his garments, took a towel, poured water into a basin, and began to wash the disciples' feet. They're arguing who's going to be the greatest. Jesus is about to die, and he's the one that picks up the towel because none of the disciples were willing to wash one another's feet. And he has to leave them an example. I'm about to die. But you know what? I want to emphasize to you, you need to be willing to serve one another. Peter said, Lord, are you washing my feet? What I do now, you do not understand, but you will know after. Lord, you shall never wash my feet. If I don't wash you, you have no part with me. Then Lord, oh, okay, Lord, not only my feet, but my head and my hands everywhere. Peter's always that way. You know, he just goes from one extreme to the other. But before I throw a stone at him, sometimes I find myself doing the same thing. He said, he who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not all of you. And so he knew who would betray him. He said, you are not all clean. And so as we're looking at the context of this, obviously he's also washing Judas's feet. Wow. Wow. And he said, do you know what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord. If I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. Most assuredly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you that does them. Now, I would suggest the idea, and I did get this a little bit out of whack here whenever you're looking at all of this together, but he probably washed his disciples' feet before they actually ate. This was one of the first things that the servants would do. When you come into a house, you show their hospitality by washing their feet. And that's the reason why he said these things. And he said to them, most assuredly, I say to you, one of you shall betray me. And he was leaning on Jesus' bosom. There was leaning on Jesus' bosom, one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. Now, again, you've got to remember that the way that they ate at that time was around a table. And they had these pillows all the way around the table. And these were kind of big pillows where about 3 men could do this and you'd be reclining. So literally, probably Jesus was here. John was here next to him. And then maybe across the way, Peter was over here. And Peter motions to John, get Jesus to tell us who it is. And he tells John, whoever I dip the sop. Now, what is dipping the sop? There was the unleavened bread, right? And then part of in this meal was a dish called the Sharoseth. It was a dish of herbs and all these things mixed together. So whenever he dipped it into this plate, he gave it to Judas. John knew who it would be. John knew who was going to betray him. And I think as you're looking at this, Jesus is even serving Judas. He washed Judas's feet. He's serving Judas. And that makes his betrayal even that much what? Even that much worse, right? So I just challenge you to think about this. Judas then left. And then Jesus, I believe, as you're looking at all of this together, this is when he institutes the Lord's Supper and said, I will not eat it with you until I eat it new with you, new in the kingdom.
Bless those who persecute you.
Yeah. So as you look at all of this, think about this idea. Some people say, well, there's contradictions in all of these. No, you've just got to take all of them and look at them together. Okay? It's kind of like you have the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, you have the New York Times, you have the New York Post, and you have the Marietta Daily Journal. And there's 4 different reporters, all talking about the same event. And every one of the reporters are what? Looking at it from different angles. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are looking at it from different angles. Luke obviously is reading about it and hearing about it later. So, and all of this is taking place. So that's where, again, trying to put all this together sometimes gets kind of convoluted a little bit. So if I had done a little bit better job in preparation, I'd have not skipped over and come back. But at least now you kind of have an idea what's happening. Judas has left. Now Jesus has instituted the Lord's Supper. And he had already emphasized the idea that Judas was going to leave, but then coming back to Luke's account, he emphasizes the idea, perhaps right after he washed their feet, he says, I am among you as one who serves. You are those who have continued with me in my trials, Luke 22, verse 28. And I bestow upon you a kingdom, just as my Father bestowed one upon me, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And then, now Judas is gone, and it may very well be again that he's talking to Peter. He says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked for you that he may sift you as wheat. And I have prayed for you that your faith should not fail. And when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren. Beautiful, beautiful story as you go on in John chapter 21. John 21 gives us an epilogue of everything. And while Jesus was still on the earth, he promised to meet them in Galilee. While they're waiting on Jesus to come there, Peter, James, and John go out fishing, and they catch this great net of fish. Much like Luke chapter 5, whenever Jesus first called them, again, they're catching this great number of fish, and Jesus spends some time with Peter. Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Lord, you know that I love you. Feed my lambs, feed my sheep, shepherd my sheep. This was Jesus' way to bring Peter back. I love the fact that he prayed for us. Listen, Jesus ever lives to make intercession for us. You know, he wants us to be successful at this thing called Christianity. So he's ever living to make intercession for us. The Spirit, Romans chapter 8, is making intercession for us. God, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are all working very hard for us to get to heaven to be with them.
It's intercession now and at judgment day both.
That's right. That's right. And it shouldn't that just motivate us to greater Christian living? Shouldn't that help us to be better Christians? Realizing they're all for us. Some people have the idea that God's against us, and they're afraid of God. And there is a sense that God is against all sin. But you know what? We're trying to do what we need to do. He's going to do what he can to help us get there. And Peter, he said, when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren. And again, when we go back and look at Luke's account, that's again what he's challenging him to do. You feed my lambs, you feed my sheep, you strengthen those brethren. And he said, Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. And Jesus said, Peter, before the rooster crows this day, you will deny 3 times that you know me. Sometimes I think we all get kind of proud of our relationship with the Lord, right? And we get to thinking the Lord can't live without it. Yes, he can. But the bottom line is whenever you've got that kind of warning, you need to really sit down and think about, okay, well, I need to listen to what's going on here. And then he says, when I sent you without money bag, knapsack, and sandals, did you lack anything? They said nothing. Now, what we need to do is go back a little passage, Matthew chapter 10, but we also go back to Luke chapter 9. He called his 12 disciples together, gave them power and authority over all the demons. And he says, take nothing for the journey, neither staff, nor bags, nor bread, nor money. Do not have 2 tunics apiece. Whatever house you enter, stay there, and from there depart. And whoever will not receive you when you go out of that city, shake off the very dust from your feet as a testimony against them. Now you have the situation where, again, he is telling them, were you lacking anything when I sent you out that way? They said, no, we had everything we needed. So now Jesus says, listen, he who has a money bag, take it. Whoever has a knapsack, he who has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. Things are about to change. God took care of you when you went out there preaching the gospel. Now I'm about to be killed. We're talking about life and death matters now. And so he said, I say to you that which is written must be accomplished. He was numbered with the transgressors. And this obviously is from Isaiah 53, verse 12, where Isaiah had prophesied about that circumstance. And he says, the things concerning me have an end. So they said, Lord, here are 2 swords. And he said to them, it is enough. Now, Jesus could have called down 12 legions of angels. But in this situation, I think he's trying to emphasize to them that, there's something that needs to happen. This is something you need to do, and you need to have these swords. Because again, I'm wanting you to understand that your life is going to be in danger. So as he continues on, he emphasizes that again, it is enough.
I think that's an interesting thing.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, there's a lot of like scholars who would say something completely different, because what he was really saying, I mean, if he was saying that these swords is enough, take these swords with you, then why did he rebuke him when he tried to cut his ear off?
Mm-hmm.
What he was really probably saying was something more metaphorical.
Mm-hmm.
He took it in the literal sense. Like,
Right.
hey, I got a sword. He's like, you don't know.
Yeah.
You don't know. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
That's right. And having 2 swords against all this crowd that came to Jesus, it would not have. But it does say something about the fact that Peter pulled his sword and tried to defend him. It does say something about that. So you have this going on. Now, he then goes to the Mount of Olives as he was accustomed. It's after the Passover. He heads to the Garden of Gethsemane, the Mount of Olives. And he came to the place, he said to them, pray that you may not enter into temptation. Now, I want you to picture yourself for just a moment in their place for just a few moments. Your master has said he's going to die. And now the events that they have been dreading are now actually going to come to pass. And so what happens now is he told them to pray. There were going to be pressure on them now like never before. Before it's all over with, all of them are going to forsake him and flee. Perhaps when Jesus needed them the most. And I think you think about this, he went and prayed, but before he went that stone throw, he knelt and prayed this. He told them, you guys need to be praying. You're going to need this strength. Now, the thing I'm trying to challenge you to think about is this. Matthew emphasizes the idea that he began to be greatly distressed and troubled. He says, my soul is exceeding sorrowful unto death. Matthew's account, Matthew 26, verse 37. And he said, remain here and watch with me. So he also talks specifically to Peter. Peter, Satan desires to sift you as wheat. Peter, you need to be doing some fervent praying right now. This is not what they wanted. This is not what they foresaw. Even though Jesus had continually told them he was going to die, they did not want this. And they certainly did not have it in their mind that Jesus was going to freely give himself to them. Jesus had probably, as he had walked along the roads of Judea and Galilee, had probably seen crosses and had probably seen how people suffered on these crosses. And he knew, he understood. And that's the reason why he prays as he does. It's Matthew's account who says that he prayed 3 times. Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. But what? Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. There's a lot of questions in a lot of people's minds as to why Jesus said that. I submit unto you that I think the reason why Jesus was dreading this was not just because of the agony of the cross itself, but because for the only time in eternity, he's going to be separated from the Father. For the only time in eternity, for 6 hours, he's going to be separated from the Father. And so he prays, if possible, let this cup pass from me. He's greatly distressed and troubled. He tells his disciples, remain here and watch with me. And so he again prays. He falls down on the ground. He kneels and then bows with his face all the way down to the ground in prayer. And he's undergoing a lot of emotions. There is the emotion. Suppose you knew, and I just want you to picture this in your mind for a moment. Suppose you were found guilty of murder and you knew that you were about to go to the electric chair. And that thought has been in your mind all this time. And you didn't know exactly what it was going to be like. And as they're strapping you down, what would you be thinking? This is going to be horrible.
Well, if it's just death, if it's just death and not the same thing, I think that there's some spiritual connotation.
Yeah. And like I said,
If you are really, like, if you're really going towards death, eventually you kind of like, well, what's going to happen?
yeah,
You got to come to that conclusion.
Right.
But like you said, like, I mean, it has to be something spiritual going on.
right. And I think, again, that part of it is because he's going to be, for the only time in eternity, this is the time he's going to be separated from the Father. That makes it even that much more agonizing. And I think, again, he kneels down and he prays, and over he's constantly praying that he might have the strength, that he might have the ability. And then he also says, through the time of the cross, why have you forsaken me?
That's the transfer.
Huh?
That's the transfer, right?
Yeah.
Transfer of the sins to the...
That's it. And why? Because God the Father is turning his back on his only son bearing your sins, my sins, and the sins of the whole world. We understand Isaiah 49 and Isaiah 50 emphasizes the idea that he would be distressed and troubled. He did not distrust God. He said, nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. And this is his faith in the Father. This is his faith in the Father. Jesus at the cross also emphasizes how costly it is sometimes to pay the price for doing the Father's will. It cost him his life. It cost him his separation from the Father. And that's the reason why when we go to those passages such as Luke 9, Luke 14, where he emphasizes, if you're going to be my disciple, you must deny yourself, take up your cross, and what? Follow me. So again, he could have been and come to this earth as a divine being and never been bothered by anything. But no, he drank the cup that we drink. He understands what death is all about. He knows what it's like to be tempted. He knows what it's like to be tried. He knows what it's like to be tempted to give in. And again, 2 Corinthians 5, verse 21, he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us. So Jesus is all alone, working out the great struggle in his own mind and heart, dreading God's will for what happens at Calvary, but knowing that on him depends the salvation of the world. That's a lot of pressure. That's a lot. And sometimes we're sitting there thinking, well, you know, it really wasn't that big of a deal for yes, it was, because he went through exactly what they needed to happen to save us. And you think about if you were in that situation, then I just challenge you to think about what he went through. One guy wrote this: the humanity of Jesus dreaded the cross. He was a man, flesh and blood body, capable of fear, shock, sorrow, weariness, weakness. We tend to forget he got tired, right?
Even the flesh is weak.
You what?
The flesh is weak.
Yeah, the flesh is weak. And so again, he was like us. He had a body like us. He had the weakness, the temptations, and everything. And so he proved to be a human being at Gethsemane when he is struggling with all this. He proved his humanity can overcome problems and obstacles.
I think this proves that the devil.
That's right. And I think it also emphasizes the idea that this is God's agape love. This is where God proves his love beyond any shadow of a doubt. Agape love is a power of choice. He chose to do this. You say,
What passages of scripture did you say? Did you say that was in Hebrews about the one who knew no sin? He made him sin for us.
I think it's 2 Corinthians 5.
Oh,
yeah,
2 Corinthians. Okay.
let me look again. I want to say it's 2 Corinthians. Looking through the notes here very quickly, yeah, 2 Corinthians 5:21. He made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. And actually, it's a whole context beginning in verse 12 and going through the end of that chapter, emphasizing those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and rose again. Verse 15. So he emphasizes the idea that if you're in Christ, he is a new creation. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. And so he's given us this ministry of reconciliation because God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. And he's committed to us that word of reconciliation. So yeah, that's the passage, 2 Corinthians chapter 5 in verse 12 through 21.
Thank you.
No problem, no problem. So that's what's going on in the garden. The Bible says here, Luke is the only one that accounts this. Luke, and back in Luke 22, he said, Father, if it's will, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And an angel appeared to him from heaven, strengthening him. Okay. So this is extremely interesting. We see the same account mentioned in Matthew 26:39. I'm sorry. I said Matthew. So there it is. So think about this. This angel is there strengthening him, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly.
Sweat blood, right?
Yes. His sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. There is a condition known as hematidrosis, where a person can be so mentally stressed out that the body reacts by some of the smaller capillaries bursting. It's that intense. And so literally you have the small capillaries in our skin and it starts coming out through the sweat pores. Yes. Yes.
It's kind of funny though. We're not funny like that, but it's kind of crazy because
Yeah.
the blood is just eager to come out.
Right. And again, before it's over with, he's going to be a bloody mess. He really is. So even here, he's dealing with this. Luke is the only one who mentions this. He's the only one that mentions this, Luke the physician. So when he rose up from prayer, the battle had been fought. Perhaps, and I submit unto you, perhaps this was the greatest battle Jesus fought right here. And whenever he finally said, okay, this is the Father's will, I'm going to do it. He had come to his disciples, he found them sleeping from sorrow. Now, Luke again tells us they're sleeping from sorrow. Matthew's account suggests to us that they were exhausted. And again, think about this. Whenever you go through a lot of stress, and I'm talking about a lot of stress.
Maybe he's speaking of himself. Because it's possible. He
Yeah.
could have been taking his own account and going, "We're tired."
Yeah, and so what's happened is they're going through a lot of stress too. And so what happens is they're just exhausted. They're tired. They don't know what's about to happen. And he tells them back in the supper, one of you shall betray me. And Peter was told, you're going to deny me 3 times. No, I'm not. You know, that's a lot of stress. That's a lot of stress. So they're exhausted. And he says, why do you sleep? Rise and pray, lest you enter into temptation. And then he goes back again, and then he comes back. And this is what Matthew's account. Luke just sums it all up in verse 45 and 46. So 45 and 46 ends it. Let's take about a 5-minute break if you need to, and we'll pick up with verse 47. Okay. Let me take that break here real quick. We're back. Where was I? Oh, yes. Luke 22, 45. Yeah. He was sweating drops of blood. He rose from prayers. He said, why do you sleep? Arise and pray, lest you enter into temptation. Yes, okay, that's what I was trying to get ready to do. While he was still speaking, a multitude, and he who was called Judas, one of the 12, went before them and drew near to Jesus to kiss him. And Jesus said, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? With an attitude of love. I mean, a kiss is something where you show love, right? And he said, you're going to betray me this way. And when those around him saw what was going to happen, they said, Lord, shall we strike with a sword? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. John's account emphasizes to us that it was Simon Peter that drew the sword and struck off the high priest's ear. And we know the name of the servant. His name was Malchus. His name was Malchus, the servant of the high priest that had his right ear cut off. His name was Malchus. So again, when you're looking at all of this at the same time, you're keying in on this. Peter was going to strike a blow for Jesus. He figured this is the way it was going to play out. And again, he meant well, but it was not part of the plan. And so Jesus specifically says, it emphasizes the idea that Jesus healed him. He touched his ear and healed him. He said to Peter, "Put your sword into the sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me?" So now, as you're looking at all of this, he then looks at them. He said to the chief priests, the captains of the temple, the elders, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you daily in the temple, you did not try to seize me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness." Jesus condemns their hypocrisy here. He condemns them because they were not willing to come and take him in front of all the crowds. They also knew that if they had done so, that they probably would have been killed. But Jesus said, "I know how you are, and I know who's doing this, and I know what's going on there." And so as we look at this again, we see Jesus going through what's happening here. So now, looking at all of this together, the soldiers, the temple police, and a great crowd armed with clubs and swords to take care of any resistance by Jesus' disciples or any wonder he might perform. Yeah, right. He was doing miracles. If he wanted to stop this, he could have stopped it, right? So again, this soldiers being with him is that seal of legality. We're doing this legally. Oh, really? Yeah, well, before it's all over with, we're going to see how legal it is. They were bringing torches to light the way, to search for the dark corners of the garden. Cords were brought to bind the prisoner, lest he overpowered them. Okay. But again, remember, he could have, right? He could have stopped it all if that's what his decision was. A guide to direct him to the place where he might be found from multitudes by one of his disciples who betrayed him. A prearranged sign of betrayal. A kiss.
I mean, I think in the fleshly sense, I don't think he was like.
Well, maybe not. We do know he was a carpenter's son. He knew what hard work was all about. So, but again, I don't think he had anything to be fearful for in that respect. So here you have this huge mob to make sure that all the other failures where they tried to get Jesus would not happen again. And what is the high priest doing? He's back in his palace, rehearsing the bribed witnesses, and what they must think the false accusation against Jesus. And so, here it has all. So what happens is you look at this, having arrested him. Now, again, as you're reading Matthew's account as well as Mark's, it seems like that they were taken by surprise, half afraid he might do a miracle. Those that were in front stumbled backwards and some of them fell down. John 18 verses 5 and 6 emphasizes that. They were not prepared for his honesty. They were not prepared for him being docile. In other words, they would have really, at that moment in time, been shocked. They were ready to fight.
You think that these elders and priests and scribes, you think it's possible to divide it?
I don't think so. Not in this situation. I think in this situation, they were going to see that he was put to death no matter what.
Well, was Nicodemus in there?
No, I don't think Nicodemus was one of the 12. We know later that when Jesus was buried, it was Joseph of Arimathea, who was a council member, as well as Nicodemus, that had a part in it. So I do not believe that Nicodemus nor Joseph were there.
But they were all against him.
Well, Nicodemus and Joseph wasn't.
No, I mean, they were all against him in that trial.
Yes, everybody was against him in that trial. But again, probably they recused themselves because of the way they felt about Jesus. Okay.
The first high priest he went to, was that
Annas.
Roman appointed high priest? Or the
No,
Jewish
it was
high
the
priest?
legitimate high priest as far as the Jews were
I
concerned.
just thought somebody might be like, are you sure about this? We're gonna kill this guy. Like one of them you think would come out and be like, I can just see them being divided because the ones that being the leaders are trying to push this into play, right?
Mhm.
No, you need to do, they probably weren't though. Like you said, they're probably like, they're submitting to whoever's in charge.
Yeah. And I think that's what it boils down to, because again, that's how they're playing this whole thing out. But notice Jesus surrendered himself. And he says, if I am the guy you're looking for, then let these go their way. Mark 14, 51 through 52 did say that they tried to seize one of his followers. Some people believe that may have been Mark, but we don't know for sure. So he just simply surrenders himself, and that's it. Judas gives them his embrace. Hail, Rabbi. And he says, okay, why are you here? You're going to betray me with a kiss? And so they threw hands upon Jesus and they seized him. This was not just, this was a bad arrest, okay? They probably all surrounded him and arrested him. Yeah, and they thought they treated him exactly like a criminal, okay? And again, they're asking him, Luke says, should now the time for us to strike the blow for freedom? And Jesus said, no. And Jesus actually heals the servant's ear. No more of this. Don't go no further. That's it.
And at that point, you think that they like took off at that point? Or whatnot?
The disciples,
Yeah.
I think so. I think they kind of backed off.
Well, they were
We
gonna
do
grab
know
him.
that John, as well as Peter, followed closely enough to go into the garden and to warm themselves by the soldiers' fire in the garden. So it was nighttime. Peter and John went to the courtyard of the high priest. John was known by the high priest, so they allowed him in. Peter went in there with him. And Peter, as we're going to see, was warming himself by, as somebody said, and there's a sermon out, warming yourself by the devil's fire. Okay. In other words, being in the wrong company at the wrong time may very well have aided Peter in denying the Lord. And that's a great lesson for so many of us in that respect. Now, again, we look in verse 52 and 53, Jesus looks at them. He says to the chief priests, the captains, and the elders, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? Why is it that he says, I was with you daily. You did not try to seize me. I see your hypocrisy. And even here, he's condemning their hypocrisy. And so having arrested him, they brought him into the high priest's house, but Peter followed at a distance. And again, John is the one who tells us that John, because he was known by the high priest, they led him to Annas first, John chapter 18, verse 13, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. And it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. And so Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now, this disciple was known to the high priest. Now, here you have John bringing this out, John 18:15. This disciple was known to the high priest and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. So obviously, because he does not mention his name, but obviously this was John. So Peter and John were there. And Peter stood at the door outside. I'm in John 18 now. The other disciple who was known to the high priest went out and spoke to her who kept the door and brought Peter in. And the servant girl who kept the door said, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." And the servants and the officers who made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood with them and warmed himself, warming by the devil's fire. Well, Luke doesn't give us all of these details. He does say that they had kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down. Peter sat among them. And a certain servant girl, seeing him as he sat by the fire, looking intently, this man was also with him. And he said, "Woman, I do not know him." After a little while, another saw him and said, "You also are of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." And after about an hour had passed, another confidently affirmed, "This fellow was with him. He is a Galilean." Now, looking at all of them together, you have two servant girls, and you have a certain servant girl who said this man was with him. Another saw him and said, "You are with him, man." And he said, "Man, I am not." So there was a man that was accusing him of it. And now another servant girl. He was afraid of the servant girls. "You sound like a Galilean. What are you doing here?" And immediately while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And it's Luke who tells us that the Lord turned and looked at Peter. So probably what was happening, and this was an hour or so probably what had happened is they had probably led Jesus into the court where the chief priests and all were. And they went through that mockery of a trial. And this continued on. Matthew tells us a little bit more about it. Mark as well tells us a little bit more about what had gone on at that point in time. And then probably as it was getting close to morning, they brought Jesus through the same courtyard where Peter had been staying that night. Jesus looked at him at that moment. Peter saw his look, and then he went out and wept bitterly. So let's go back and get kind of the rest of the story as we're looking at all of them together here. It just mentions in Peter, and as Luke is telling the story, he mentions everything that happened in that situation, and he weeps bitterly. But let's kind of go back and look at Matthew's account and so forth. We're looking now at Matthew chapter 26, verse 57. Now, Matthew also tells us that in the betrayal, they had laid hands on him, and he tells Peter here, Matthew 26, 52, "Put your sword in its place. Do you not think that I can now pray to my Father, and he will deliver me more than 12 legions of angels?" And so he asked him a question: "Have you come out against me as a robber?" But he said, "This is done." And so they took him away to Caiaphas, where the scribes and the elders were assembled, and Peter followed at a distance. Now, Mark tells us that first he was taken to Annas. Annas was the legitimate high priest. Caiaphas was the high priest that the Romans put into play. Now, just kind of give you a little bit of an understanding. Annas was the father-in-law to Caiaphas. He was the official high priest at the time. The house of Annas was the most powerful in all Judaism in that era and was detested by the common people. Annas was a Sadducee. He was a Sadducee. What do we remember about the Sadducees? They didn't believe in a resurrection. By the way, let me remind you, and I may have told you this before, and if I did, please bear with me. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection. That's fair, you see. The Sadducees did not. That's sad, you see. So that's one way to remember that, okay? Always keep that in mind. They did not believe in the resurrection. All righty? He had been deposed by the Roman Procurator Gratus in AD 14. He had 5 of his sons. Annas had 5 of his sons appointed to the high priesthood. And then his son-in-law Caiaphas, and one of his grandsons. Okay, so this is kind of the kind of person that he was. He was first brought before Annas, then Caiaphas. In both trials, every bit of human rights was cast out the window. They didn't care. This was a kangaroo court. They had already decided what was going to happen. In capital cases under the laws of Judaism, both the trial and the verdict had to be delivered during the daytime. And they didn't do that. And this was in the middle of the night. In all the interrogation by Annas, there were no witnesses, no evidence presented. Even in Jewish law, a man was presumed innocent until proven guilty by at least 2 or more witnesses. There's no witnesses here in Annas's case. Then you have him being brought before Caiaphas, where they had bribed false witnesses against him. And even their testimony didn't agree. They contradicted one another so bad that the high priest had to resort to Jesus saying, "Tell us about yourself. You defend yourself." And so he tells them that, I am who you think I am. And that is enough. That's enough to cause him to be put to death. The Pilate would later see through the hypocrisy and the sham of the whole thing. And he tried to get Jesus off. This whole thing was just a railroad in every situation. And so, as I said, it's Luke, who tells us that at the end of this is where this is where Peter goes out and weeps bitterly. Now, think about this as well. The men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him. We're going to beat a confession out of you. Well, what do you want me to confess? You claim to be the Son of God. I gladly confess that. I've said that the whole time I was here. What else do you need?
Didn't they beat him with the it's like a whip that has like these sharp things
Yeah,
on it?
but that was the Romans. That was the Romans' way of doing it. Under the Jewish law, they were allowed to beat a person 40 stripes save one. Okay.
Like with a stick or something?
They could beat him with a stick. They could have beat him with a whip. Okay. The Romans were under their law allowed them to beat them. And a lot of those people died under the scourging because of the amount of blood loss, things along that line. So right now, he's being beaten and they blindfold him and then they hit him. And I don't think it's just slaps in the faces. They struck him on the face. And I think they full fist hit him with everything they had because they hated him so much. So by the time Jesus actually gets brought to Pilate, he's already bleeding. Maybe has a busted nose, black eyes. If you're really who you say you are, we're going to blindfold you. Now tell us who hit you. They're mocking him. They're beating him in all of this. And many other things they, notice Luke's account, blasphemously spoke against him. What are they doing? And they're blaspheming him. And so now it was early in the morning on that Saturday. As soon as it was day, then the elders of the people, chief priests and scribes came together and led him into their council, saying, "If you are the Christ, tell us." He said, "If I tell you, you will not believe." He says, "If I ask you, you will by no means answer me or let me go. But you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power of God. Are you then the Son of God?" And he says, "You rightly say that I am." And that was enough. And they said, "What further testimony do we need? We've heard it ourselves from his own mouth."
But isn't it sons of God used in a lot of other contexts too?
Yes, and depending on the context.
Well, I mean, if I'm I'm not mistaken, the angels were called sons of God.
right?
There's kings or whatever.
Kings were called sons of God. That's right. So this wasn't the first time this is used that way. But you see, they knew what he was claiming about himself. And they knew that. And they were upset because all up to this point in time, they hadn't been able to stop him. And they said, now we've got him. We can put him on the charge of blasphemy against God. But that's not going to work with the Romans. They could have cared less. It was all about money. It was all about power. It was all about them being in control of this whole situation. So after having that declaration by the whole Sanhedrin, you know what I'm trying to say here, this mockery of the whole thing, trying to get him to testify against himself, hiring false witnesses against him, being beaten up by the soldiers, trying to beat something out of him, they were not allowed to actually execute the death penalty. Now, interestingly enough, and I find this extremely interesting, you'll find that in the book of Acts chapter 7, they do take Stephen out and stone him to death. But if you read what's happening right around that same time frame, they're actually going through, not Stephen. They accused him of, they got very angry at him. Read through Acts chapter 7. They actually stoned him. But I think what's happening there, from what Josephus was saying, is they were going through a change in who the Roman procurator was. So there was a guy that had gone back to Rome to answer to Tiberius, and there was another guy that was coming to take his place. And during that time frame, when there was no Roman governor there, that's when they stoned Stephen to death. Okay. So it's interesting as you look at it and play how this all plays out when you compare it with Josephus and some of the other events, that's exactly what happened. So this whole multitude then arose and led him to Pilate. Now let's talk for a few moments about Pilate. All righty. Pilate was not the best fella in the world. All righty. So they're bringing Jesus for trial. I said Saturday, but it could, that's right. It was Friday at sunrise because Jesus was in the grave for 3 days. So we've got to remember that. It was that Friday. Saturday was the Sabbath. So they're trying to get this done, railroaded, and him die upon the cross before that Sabbath day actually took place. So this is kind of what's going on. Again, think about it. He was arrested without a warrant by a mob on a feast day. He was taken before someone who had no official standing and interrogated. He was brought before an illegal gathering of Jewish officials at night, falsely accused, no witnesses to accuse him, and this council met illegally. They had already decided he's guilty. Okay. Think about witnesses were bribed to bear false testimony. He was adjured to testify against himself, forced to testify against himself. All the claims that he made in his own behalf were not introduced into the court proceedings. He did not have anybody to stand to defend him. He was allegedly arrested for one charge, and when brought before the illegal gathering of the council, was condemned for another charge. He was abused, mocked, reviled, and physically assaulted in the presence of civil officials, charged with law and order. And he was brought before the Jewish council, given a guilty sentence, which was contrary to the legal practice of the council. No warrant for arrest, no charge, no evidence, no testimony, no legal proceedings, nothing. This was a railroad. Any way you want to put it. We've already decided you're guilty. We're going to make sure that you are. All righty? And again, this was part of what God had planned. Think about it this way. Jesus knew no sin. He had not sinned. So they couldn't find any charge against him that would stick. They couldn't. So they had to go at it this way. And again, their biggest problem was what? Jesus claimed to be God in the flesh, John 1:1. And they could not wrap their mind around God being in the flesh. So we go on to chapter 23. Now, again, just kind of give you some ideas of what's going on here. As I said, Pilate, you've got to understand what's going on with him. He's stuck in the middle. Anybody in the middle, they're going to catch it both ways. He is there by charge of the Roman governor, of the Roman Empire. And really, when you get down to it, he was there during the time of Tiberius Caesar. Tiberius Caesar was not a model emperor, okay? This man, as I said, if you go back and you read about the 12 Caesars by Suetonius and some of these others, he was a depraved sex maniac. He literally, in a lot of different ways, he had a free hand, but again, he was out to get everybody. The Caesars, a lot of times, were so afraid that somebody was going to kill them. So they're always out to get these people no matter what. The territory of Judea, being under the direct rule of a Roman procurator, was not allowed to execute capital punishment. So Pilate was in constant conflict with the Jews. He's also in conflict with Tiberius. He got into it with Tiberius a couple of times. So now they're both wanting him, okay? They're both wanting to kill him. In one situation, he came to Palestine and he wanted to abolish all the Jewish laws and customs. He found out this wasn't going to happen. He brought effigies of Caesar to Jerusalem, set them up at night. And when the Jews heard about it, they came and they literally camped around his palace, imploring him to remove them. When he refused, he called them to his judgment seat. He surrounded them with an army, and they all fell down and said, "Cut our heads off. We're not going to serve you." And word got back to Tiberius. And Tiberius said, "You know what? You've got to rule these people, not kill them all. You've got to rule them." Another time, Pilate built an aqueduct, bringing water to improve Jerusalem's water supply. Guess where he tried to get the money? From the temple. And the Jews were not going to have anything like that. The Jews rioted. Again, Pilate ordered them slain. And the bottom line is, they just said, again, he just said, "I can't kill them all."
I don't understand what they did. What did they do?
Well, it was like everything else. They paid taxes and everything else to support the government and everything else. So, and especially in the temple, they would be using it to buy sacrifices and so forth, to take care of the priests. There were certain amounts of money that was to be given to the priest to support them. So all of that comes into play as well. In another situation, Luke chapter 13, verse 1, we've already read about the fact that some of the Galileans were killed. And that created problems. Who gave them the encouragement to do that? It was Pilate. And this may be the part of the reason why him and Herod Antipas was at odds with one another. Herod Antipas was in charge of Galilee. And so when he called some of the Galileans to be killed, Herod Antipas got upset and said, "Okay, you don't have the right to do that." So Herod Antipas and Pilate were knocking heads with one another. And finally, about AD 36, there was a prophet who asserted that Moses' tabernacle and holy vessels were buried on Mount Gerizim in Samaria. So many of the Jews tried to climb Mount Gerizim in Samaria and dig up these, and they were all killed. All of these killed were slain by Pilate. And he was called to Rome, and right here at this particular time would have been banished. This was about AD 36. And tradition says that Pilate committed suicide in Spain, near Spain, or in Spain, because he had been.
How did he commit suicide?
I don't know. It doesn't specifically say he committed suicide. That's all it says. Yeah. Yeah. There were a lot of people again, because again, the Jews were always looking for some way to get rid of Pilate. They did not like him at all. So this is kind of what's going on here. Now, that's kind of the background that I want you to realize as they bring him to Pilate. And Pilate, he doesn't have no love lost at all for the Jews. They're a backwater province of the Roman Empire, and he just really didn't want to have to deal with this. But here was also another thing. Here was going to be a person that they railroaded, and here was his chance to really rub it in on them. But he doesn't do it because, huh? I'm talking about Pilate. He could have rubbed it in on the Jews and saying, you have not followed the law. But he didn't, because of all these other events that were taking place that had already put him in bad terms with Tiberius. The last thing he needed was the Jews to revolt again over something else. So this all comes into play here. This all comes into play. He says, we found this fellow perverting the nation. That's their accusation. He's perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesars, saying that he himself is Christ, a king.
That's not true either.
No, Jesus had emphasized the idea of pay custom to whom custom is due, right? That's right. Pay your taxes, pay the taxes to whom taxes is due. And so in looking at all of this, he just says, are you the king of the Jews? Now, picture this in your mind for a moment. The Jews had been upset with Jesus. They had beaten him that night. So he's bruised and bloodied already. I'm sure they didn't clean him up to bring him to Pilate. And they look at the hypocrisy. Are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus said, it is as you say. A bloodied man, the king of the Jews. Who brought him there? The chief priests, the elders, the Sanhedrin preferred charges against him. Now, this just didn't make any sense at all to Pilate. If he's who he said, if he's who you claim he says he is, why are you helping me now? Pilate did have the responsibility to keep Roman law. And if somebody claimed to be going against Roman law, he had the responsibility to make sure that they weren't. But this guy was bruised and bloodied. You've already done this, and you have been against me and the Romans all along anyway, and you're bringing me this guy? You should have let him lead you in the revolt. If what you say is true. No, we're just here because we're good Roman citizens. No. Do you see the hypocrisy in all of this?
You couldn't kill him, because they would have the blood on their hands, right?
Well, that, and they could not because, again, the Jews were not allowed to practice capital punishment. The Romans.
How are they not allowed to do it because of Rome?
Yeah, because Rome would not allow them to do
I
that.
thought I was going to say
Old Testament, yes, but they're under Roman governorship, and the Romans are the ones who said who can and live and who can die. So you see, that's what put them in this whole situation, in this whole place. So they've been saying that Jesus had been going through the nation, subverting, twisting, corrupting people, teaching them to resist Caesar's taxes, claiming himself to be a king. And he just asked him, are you a king? And he said, it is as you say. And he said, I find no fault in this man. You people are crazy. Now, notice he didn't observe the full legal procedure. He did, however, imitate it to a certain event. He had full discretion in judgment. No Jew had the right to appeal to Caesar unless he was also a Roman citizen. Now, Paul was a Roman citizen. We're going to see later that he does appeal to his Roman citizenship to defend himself. Okay? But again, they were not, these Romans were not going to have any problems whatsoever if that's what Pilate wanted. If Pilate wanted to have him killed, that'd been it. He would have.
Same situation, Bill, you're talking about, because Paul appealed to the emperor, right? And then that was what they found fault in, right? Am I wrong?
He appealed to the emperor, but actually it was, when you go back and read that account, they are there in before that, and they said, they just made a very blanket condemnation of Paul, saying he teaches things according to the law. Well, what law? And so he realized the way things were going, and so he says, I appeal to Caesar. And now that put him under Roman protection because he was a Roman citizen. And so they could not touch him now.
Yeah.
They could not touch him at all. Because if they had killed a Roman citizen, the Romans would have been all over them. So all of this comes into play here. Matthew tells us that Pilate knew that he had delivered Jesus for envy. Envy. He saw an opportunity to get back at these guys now. Okay, you guys have been giving me a hard time right now. So listen, where is, where is the evidence? I want to see it. And again, all of these accusations, think about it, this was really what they wanted. They wanted to stop paying Caesar. They wanted to be able to execute whoever they wanted to do. Yes, Matthew's account does say, leave that man alone, for I've had many dreams about him this night. Pilate's wife did that. They were accusing they were accusing Jesus of the desires of their own heart. We don't want to pay taxes to you guys anymore, and we don't want you here over here anymore. Yet this is what we're accusing him of, okay? And they did refuse a few years after Jesus' death to pay taxes to Caesar, and that's what brought on the War of the Jews in 64 AD.
It's kind of crazy how they betrayed, even if they disagree with him, he's their own people.
That's right. That's right. Politics. Listen, politics is still politics today, just like it was back then. It's politics. They're going to make it to where they are going to be what they want to be and do what they want to do. It's politics. Life doesn't change. You know, we get frustrated with the Republicans and the Democrats and who's saying what and all this other stuff, and we follow this stuff, and it just about drives us absolutely insane. And the bottom line is, this isn't nothing new.
I think you should be afraid of anybody that wants to have that position, that wants to be over people and be responsible for that.
Yeah.
It's not a good sign of character. Something's not right there.
Yeah. What sort of king are you? Are you really the king of the Jews? Are you really a threat to the Romans? No, I don't think so. Are you just really doing what the Jews were saying? You know, I know you're not a king. I'm just repeating the charge of your countrymen, John 18, verse 35. They're Jews. What? Well, how are you using the term king? How are you using the term king? And what did Jesus say? My kingdom is not of this world. John 18, verse 36. I'm not threatening Rome. My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, I would have an army behind me. No, but I am making the claim to be a descendant of David, who was king of Israel. And a lot of times Jesus will emphasize that idea that he is a descendant of David in that respect. So he's not claiming to have a worldly throne like the Jewish council had accused him. He's not trying to kick Rome out. He's using the term in another way. Yes, you have said so. You are correct. I'm Messiah of the Jews, but I'm no threat to you. I'm no threat to you. John 18:37, for this was I born, and for this I've come into the world to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. And Pilate asked that great question. What is truth? What is truth? And so you see, he didn't say it flippantly. He was struggling with his own conscience here a little bit. He said this, he knew that this was going to eventually come to a head. He's going to have to decide to release this guy. And if he releases this guy, then the chief priest and everybody else would have stirred all the people up to have him killed, and he would have a rebellion on his hands. And the easiest solution is to let this man die, placate the Jews, and I'll keep my position a little while longer. Politics.
But he put the other guy where I was like, you don't want this guy to go free, do you?
Yeah. You know, he was pressed. He was torn. He was right in the middle. He knew what he should have done. He didn't do it. He philosophized what is truth. The bottom line is, I'm going to have to deal with this situation one way or another. I see what's going on. He comes out again in Luke 23 and said, I find no fault in this man. He sat down and discussed, I find no fault. But they were the more fierce, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee to this place. Oh, so all the way up to the northern part, all the way down to where we are now, he's just fomenting revolution. Wait a minute. Here's my out. Herod's here. Herod the Tetrarch, the guy that I haven't been getting along with. This Herod that John the Baptist condemned because he had his brother's wife. I'm going to let Herod handle this problem. I'm going to kick this to somebody else because guess what? Herod is in charge of Galilee. So he knows more about this guy, Jesus, than I would. Let him make that final decision. And I'll abide for whatever it is. He asked if the man were a Galilean, verse 6. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. Now, why was Herod there? The Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Herod had married, Herod the Great had married a Jewish woman. He had married some Jewish women, okay? So he's there knowing that it's politically well if you go to the feast and enjoy the feast with the Jews, even though he was of the family of the Edomites. The Edomites would be, again, this is Herod the Great, but as you read through that whole account, Herod the Great had married many Jewish princesses. So, okay. Now, when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had desired for a long time to see him. He had heard many things about him, and he hoped to see some miracle done by him. Now, you remember earlier, we talked about the fact that he believed that Jesus was John the Baptist resurrected. That's the reason why he wanted to see him. He had remembered that he had caused John the Baptist to lose his life. And so the thing was, so he wanted to see him. He's taken to Herod. Herod starts questioning him, and Jesus answered him nothing. Why didn't Jesus say anything to Herod? Number one, he was not under Herod's jurisdiction here. He was under Roman jurisdiction. Why? The Jews had kicked him up to that. Herod did not have the right to make a judgment call on this situation. Pilate was the one who had to make the final decision. Pilate was trying to kick the ball down the road. He didn't want to have to deal with this. And so, again, you have the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. Then Herod, with his men of war, treated him with contempt and mocked him. So now you have not only Jesus being beaten from the trial of the Sanhedrin, brought before Pilate in disgrace. Now Herod's men arrayed him in a gorgeous robe. They treated him with contempt and mocked him and sent him back to Pilate. And that very day, Pilate and Herod became friends with each other. As I said earlier, Pilate had ordered the death of some of the Galileans, and Herod no doubt felt like Pilate was encroaching upon his territory. Now that Pilate had done that, they're now become friends. And so Pilate is kicked back in his court once again. And so Pilate, after being made friends with this, when he called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, he said, "You brought this man to me as one who misleads the people. And indeed, having examined him in your presence, I found no fault in this man concerning the things of which you accuse him. Herod did not find any fault. And I sent him back to him. Nothing deserving of death has been done by him. I will therefore chastise him and release him." And they were having none of that. They were having none of that. And notice in Luke's account, it was necessary for him to release one of them at the feast. There had been a custom started years ago to where they would release somebody that had been arrested. And that person would be allowed to be free. And so now Pilate was wanting to use that as an opportunity to release him. And again, going back to what you were saying, Josh, you're exactly right. His wife has said, "Have nothing to do with that man, for I've suffered many things in a dream because of him."
So it probably stifled him.
Yeah.
Probably like, well,
Yeah.
pressure on both
Both sides.
You got these guys over here that's saying, "Hey, you better kill this guy,
Mhm.
or they're gonna riot."
Right.
And then his wife's saying, "Don't kill him, he's an innocent man."
And he himself said what? He's innocent. And by law, he should have allowed Jesus to go free. But he didn't. So he gives them a choice. He lets them choose. Matthew's account tells us that he gives them a choice between Jesus and Barabbas. And he tells them, not once, but 2 times, "I find nothing wrong with this man. Let me have him beaten." And I think at this time, he does allow them to scourge him. This goes back to what you were talking about earlier. Earlier, the chief priests and so forth, their soldiers probably hit him in the face with fists, maybe beat him with a rod. Now they scourge him. There are some commentaries that suggest the fact that every criminal that was crucified would have been scourged. Then there are others that said, no, it just depends on the why would you scourge a man whenever you're going to crucify him?
Well, he was trying to get an out, wasn't he?
Right. And I think that's what it was.
I think that even when he was crucifying him, I feel like he was probably saying, like, eventually he's got to get that. This is not that serious.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
they're gonna drag him through the street.
Right. And so as all this starts playing out, he's trying his best to figure out a way to get him. Okay, I'll scourge him. Whenever they see his bloody back and they see him suffering in all this respect, then they will let him go. They will have mercy now. No.
He would have bled a lot from that.
He would have bled a lot from that. And I reading some of this and some of the commentaries I would suggest reading, it amazes you. It would be a whip. The end of the whip would have pieces of bone in it, or metal balls. The metal balls would have created bruises. Then the bones would have opened them, blooding and bleeding in that respect. According to some of the people that were whipped lost their teeth because the whip would come across their face.
It's very graphic.
Yeah. lose eyeballs in the process. Okay, this was not. And again, the Jews had a law, 40 stripes save one. The Jews were under no compunction to live by that. Excuse me, the Romans were under no compunction to live by that. Do what?
40 stripes, what?
40 stripes minus one.
Oh,
It
Yeah.
would have been a very travesty if they miscounted
Yeah,
and accidentally did 41.
yeah,
So that's why
they would
stopped at
count,
39,
yeah,
in case
39.
they made a mistake.
Yeah.
good.
So if the-
That's a good point.
Seriously, so if you had a whip that had 3 thongs on it, you could have hit them 13 times. Okay. I know it sounds crazy to us, but that's it. But the Romans were under no compunction to live by that.
No rehabilitation, not
Nope.
like, I want to help you live a better life and then we'll let you go.
Well, tell me,
Nope.
did you say that the Jews had their own soldiers?
Yeah.
So the soldiers that arrested Jesus were actually Jewish soldiers?
Yeah.
No.
Now, I think at the same time, they may have gotten some Roman soldiers, but by and large, the majority of them would have been the soldiers of the temple that would have guarded the temple.
That was a good thing about
So the Jews were allowed to maintain their own army, so to speak?
Not an entire army, but they were allowed to have their guys that were protecting the high priest. They would be protecting the temple, keeping the Gentiles out from the forbidden areas of the temple. They would have had
Powers
that.
of enforcement of certain things.
They did have powers and enforcement.
Think of not necessarily military
Yeah.
soldiers, but
Yeah.
enforcement.
what if that Roman soldier that he healed, the servant, would have been there? Wouldn't that, he might have said something. maybe not.
He might have, but again, we don't read anything about it.
I know, I'm just
You
thinking
know,
it's kind of ironic.
yeah, It is. And it's like I also emphasized to you when we looked at that earlier, every time you read about a centurion in scripture, they are always applauded for their faith.
Yeah, those
Yeah.
guys wouldn't have been around.
Yeah,
Cornelius or whatever.
yeah, no.
Probably not.
He was been later, obviously, but we don't know if he would have known all of this or not. I don't know. I don't know. So yeah, it would have been all of that. Appreciate you bringing this out because all of this, I'm trying for as much as I can to help us to understand what he went through. And so he gives them a choice. Jesus, beaten, bloodied, or Barabbas. Now, Barabbas had been found guilty of murder under Roman law. He had been guilty of leading in a revolt against Rome. He had been guilty of all of these things. And it's interesting, this man had been thrown into prison for a certain rebellion made in the city and for murder. And so I think he brings out his worst criminal. And here's this guy, he's revolted against Rome, and this is what he is. And here's this Jesus, whom I find no fault in him at all. He told it before the chief priest. He also would say it to all the people, to where all the people would hear it. I find no guilt in him. So really, when you get down to it, they should have chosen Jesus to be released. They chose Barabbas because why? The chief priests were stirring the people up.
You know what's funny about that though, too, though? Because Jesus, right, they wanted him to be a physical, right?
Mhm.
And that's kind of what Barabbas did. He tried to rule over them, which is what they wanted Jesus to do. So it was like he was right there, and then you have spiritual,
Mhm.
you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It was a different thing altogether.
There's something else I want you to think about. If there's anybody on the face of the earth that found out what grace was about, it was Barabbas.
Oh, yeah.
Condemned to die, set free by Jesus, or because of what Jesus did. If anybody understood what grace was, in fact, I think years ago they had an old movie out that portrayed Barabbas and portrayed the idea that Barabbas later became a Christian.
Well, but they don't say anything
Okay.
about it, do they?
No, it doesn't. Not in the Bible. It does not. It does not.
I look for that.
But it does emphasize the idea that he knew what, I mean, he was there for rebellion and murder, and that was capital offenses any way you want to look at it.
Well, some of those Jesus movies, they actually put a whole other story in there where
Yeah.
Jesus is supposed to have crossed paths with him
Mhm.
and tried to convince him that that was or
Yeah.
one or the other.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
And that happens so many times, you know. The story Ben-Hur is kind of the same idea,
Yeah.
you know. So all of those things come into play. Pilate, again, wishing to release Jesus, again called out to them, saying, but they shouted, crucify, crucify. Why? What evil has he done? I found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go. But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and the chief priests prevailed. So it says Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested. And he released to them the one they requested, one who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison. But he delivered Jesus to their will. I didn't get as far as I wanted to. So if you want to meet one more time, or we can meet one more time, or I can go ahead and just try to get through all of this and send you the video. Comments, questions, thoughts? Okay. All right. Well, I'll go ahead and just probably sometime between now and then, I'll try to get this out before next Thursday.
Are you gonna do a final, are you gonna send it to us in the meantime?
I'm going to do the final working on that. Yeah, I'm working on that now.
Did you grade the other one?
I'm starting to, yeah. I've got 2 or 3, so I will be sending that and get that grade too if you're taking this for credit. I appreciate all of you so much. Hang in there. I won't say that I enjoy it, but I am grateful for the fact that we study this crucifixion in detail, because it gives us a greater appreciation for what he did. And every time I read through this and preach on this and see how he died, I am just so grateful.
People can say what they want to say about the movies, but
Yeah.
you know, especially that Passion of Christ, man,
And you know, I've never seen that one.
it puts into
Yeah.
perspective,
Yeah.
like, because you know, I mean, like words on a page is one thing, descriptions.
Mhm.
And for some people, that's more than a movie, but I'm saying when you see it, like, it has a dramatic effect. I can't help about tearing up.
Yeah. I think sometimes we've heard the story so often. We think about it every Sunday whenever we partake of the Lord's Supper. We've heard the story so often, it's become no big deal. And I hope and pray that every one of us will stop for a few minutes and think it was a big deal. We couldn't be here if he didn't die. We sometimes gloss over these things and we don't look at them in quite as much detail, and we just think, well, we've heard the stories time and time and time again, and maybe sometimes because we hear the story so often, it doesn't touch our heart as maybe the first time when we really think about what he did. And I hope and pray that this touches our hearts, that it makes us think, and that we appreciate what he did even that much more. Comments or questions, thoughts?
Well, we appreciate having you as a teacher.
So we're not going to meet next week, right?
No, I'm going to try to do this video and do that, but this actually is supposed to be the last night of the class. And I kind of figured the way Luke was going that I wasn't going to cover it all. So. But I'll try to go through that, and maybe about another hour and a half tops, and we'll be done. Okay. All righty.
All right.
And that teaches me that next time I have to go a little bit faster through Luke. But at the same time, like I said, I do like the details because if I've made you stop and think more about him and his life, then I've succeeded. Okay. And that's really what it's all about.
Well, those Bible studies, when they try to go through it line by line, they do the same thing. They'll get into one thing really, really deep. And
Mhm.
they're like, well, I gotta rush through this.
Yeah.
And then be like, well, if it's a church, I don't understand why they don't just do it until you finish it.
Yeah. And that's what I've been doing. I'm also teaching this at South Cobb on Wednesday nights. And of course, we started here a little bit earlier than I did at South Cobb, but we're just now in chapter 9.
Is that another campus?
No, it's this Wednesday night Bible class where I
Oh,
preach.
okay.
Yeah, so thank y'all, and I'll get this to you and have a test to you also before long. Any other questions, comments, thoughts, ideas? I appreciate all of you so very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
For your love, and thank you for your commitment to study this. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you, Brother Tilton.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, y'all take care.
Have a good
Bye.
Bye.